The first thing Mark noticed was how quiet the lake had become, a kind of silence that felt deliberate, as if Lake Michigan itself was holding its breath just for him, and that was when he realized the sunset felt different from all the others he had watched before. It was late October in 2023, a Friday evening slipping slowly into dusk, and the cold had already settled into the air along the shoreline near Montrose Harbor in Chicago. The wind carried the sharp smell of water and fallen leaves, brushing against Mark's jacket as he stood with his hands in his pockets, staring westward while the sun hovered low over the city skyline. Behind him, the traffic along Lake Shore Drive hummed steadily, distant horns and engines blending into a familiar urban rhythm, but in front of him the lake stretched wide and dark, reflecting streaks of orange, copper, and fading gold. Mark had lived in Chicago most of his life, long enough to know that Lake Michigan could look calm and endless one moment, and restless and unforgiving the next, but tonight it seemed unusually still. Mark Henderson was 42 years old, a structural engineer by training, and until recently, someone who believed his life followed a clear and predictable pattern. He had grown up on the South Side, attended the University of Illinois, married his college girlfriend, and spent nearly 2 decades designing bridges and commercial buildings across the Midwest. His days were filled with measurements, calculations, deadlines, and meetings, and his nights were usually spent at home in Evanston, eating dinner in front of the television, scrolling through news headlines, and falling asleep before 10. Sunsets over the lake had always been a quiet habit, something he did when he needed air, when the walls of his routine felt too close, but never something he thought too deeply about. That evening, though, Mark was not at the lake out of habit. He was there because earlier that morning, at 9:17 a.m., his phone had buzzed while he sat at his desk, and the message he read had unraveled a version of the future he thought he understood. The email came from his firm's managing director, short and carefully worded, requesting a meeting at noon. By 12:45, Mark had packed a small cardboard box with framed photos, a coffee mug from a conference in Denver, and a notebook filled with half-finished ideas. Budget cuts, restructuring, a shift in company priorities. That was how they explained it. None of the words sounded personal, but the effect was devastating all the same. After leaving the office, Mark drove without a plan, letting instinct guide him north until the buildings thinned and the lake appeared again, wide and gray under a clouded sky. He parked near the harbor around 4:30 p.m. and walked along the concrete path, watching joggers pass by, couples walking dogs, and cyclists wrapped in scarves and gloves. Everyone seemed to be moving forward with purpose, while he felt strangely suspended, caught between what his life had been and what it might become next. As the sun lowered, the clouds parted just enough to let the light spill through, painting the water in warm colors that contradicted the cold in the air. Mark checked his watch. 5:52 p.m. sunset would be complete in less than 15 minutes. He remembered coming here years ago with his father, long before the skyline had changed so much, before the new glass towers reshaped the horizon. His father had worked nights at a manufacturing plant near Gary, Indiana, and on his days off, he would drive Mark along the lake, pointing out freighters on the water and talking about how the lake connected cities and lives across multiple states. Standing there now, Mark felt the weight of those memories pressed gently against his chest. His father had passed away 3 years earlier, in early spring, when the lake was still cold and restless. Mark had watched the sunset alone the evening after the funeral, convinced that grief would come in waves and then recede. Instead, it had lingered quietly, much like the uncertainty he felt now. The sky continued to shift, the bright oranges softening into muted pinks and purples, and the buildings to the west slowly turned into silhouettes. The wind picked up slightly, rippling the surface of the water, and Mark zipped his jacket higher, feeling the chill seep into his hands. He wondered how many times he had stood here before without really seeing it, without understanding that moments like this were never guaranteed, never promised to repeat themselves in the same way. Somewhere nearby, a woman laughed, the sound carried briefly by the wind before fading. A fairy horn echoed in the distance, low and resonant, reminding him that the lake was not just scenery, but a working body of water, moving people and goods, shaping lives in quiet ways. Mark thought about calling his wife, but hesitated. They had spoken briefly after his meeting, her voice concerned but steady, already shifting into problem-solving mode. They would talk later, he told himself, after he had space to think, after the sun finished setting. As the light continued to dim, Mark felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. It was not just about the job, he realized, but about time, about the years that seemed to move faster with each season. He thought about the projects he never finished, the risks he never took, the conversations he postponed because there was always another day. Watching the sun sink toward the horizon, he felt a growing awareness that some endings arrived quietly, without ceremony, disguised as ordinary evenings by the lake. The last edge of the sun hovered just above the water now, casting a narrow band of light across the surface, like a path that led somewhere he could not see. Mark stood perfectly still, afraid that if he moved, he might break whatever fragile balance held the moment together. He did not know why this sunset felt so significant, only that a part of him sensed it was marking a boundary, a line between before and after, even if he could not yet name what lay on the other side. As darkness began to gather along the shoreline and the first city lights flickered on behind him, Mark remained facing the lake, watching, waiting, unaware that the choices he would make after this moment, after this fading light over Lake Michigan, were already beginning to take shape in ways he could not yet fully understand. The air grew colder as the sun finally slipped beneath the horizon, leaving behind a dim afterglow that stretched thin across the sky, and Mark exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath without realizing it. The lake darkened into a deep slate color, its surface catching fragments of reflected city lights that shimmered and disappeared with each small wave. He checked his phone again, 6:12 p.m., and for the first time that day, there were no new notifications, no emails demanding attention, no calendar alerts reminding him where he was supposed to be next. Mark took a few steps closer to the water's edge, careful not to slip on the damp concrete, and listened. The sounds around him had changed. Fewer cars passed now, their headlights streaking briefly along Lake Shore Drive before vanishing into the distance. The joggers were gone, replaced by a handful of quiet figures standing alone or in pairs, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The lake lapped gently against the shore, a steady, almost reassuring rhythm that contrasted with the restless thoughts in his mind. He thought about the drive home he was avoiding, the familiar streets of Evanston, the porch light that would already be on, and the questions waiting for him inside. What happens next? How long can we manage? Are you going to look for something similar, or is this the moment you finally change course? Mark had no answers yet, and for once, that uncertainty felt heavy rather than abstract. It sat in his chest, solid and undeniable. A memory surfaced unexpectedly, from a summer evening nearly 15 years earlier, when he and his wife, Claire, had sat on the same stretch of shoreline after a concert downtown. They had been younger then, still renting a small apartment, still believing that effort and patience would naturally lead to security. They talked about children, about moving closer to the lake someday, about jobs that would challenge them without consuming them. Standing here now, Mark wondered when those conversations had quietly faded, replaced by schedules, responsibilities, and the unspoken assumption that there would always be time later. The wind shifted, carrying the distant smell of food from a nearby hot dog stand closing up for the night. Mark's stomach tightened, reminding him that he had barely eaten all day. He considered leaving, but something held him in place, an intuition he could not explain. It felt important to remain a little longer, to let the moment settle, to allow whatever this evening was trying to tell him to become clearer. He glanced down the shoreline and noticed an older man sitting on a bench, wrapped in a thick coat, staring out at the water with the same stillness Mark felt inside himself. For a brief second, their eyes met, and the man nodded, a small, knowing gesture, before returning his gaze to the lake. The exchange lasted less than a heartbeat, but it left an impression. Mark wondered how many people had stood here at turning points in their lives, watching the same horizon, feeling the same mix of fear and possibility. As the sky deepened into navy blue, the first stars struggled to appear through the city glow. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again, this time scrolling through photos without really looking at them. Construction sites, family gatherings, a blurry shot of the lake from a year ago, taken on a day that had felt ordinary at the time. He paused on that image, noticing how similar the colors were, how he had no memory of what he was thinking when he took it. The realization unsettled him. How many moments had passed without leaving a trace, simply because he had been too busy looking ahead? The temperature continued to drop, and Mark finally allowed himself to sit on a low concrete barrier near the water. He rested his elbows on his knees, hands clasped together, and let his thoughts wander without trying to organize them. He imagined alternative versions of his life, paths not taken, decisions delayed. He imagined waking up months from now, heading to a new office, or perhaps somewhere entirely different, and he wondered which version of himself would step into that future. Behind him, the city lights brightened, illuminating the outlines of buildings and casting long reflections across the lake. In front of him, the water absorbed the darkness, endless and opaque. Mark felt small in a way that was not entirely uncomfortable. The lake had been here long before him and would remain long after, indifferent to his successes and failures. Somehow, that thought brought a sense of relief. He stayed there as the night settled fully, unaware of how much time had passed, until the cold finally began to bite through his jacket. Slowly, Mark stood, brushing off his hands, and took one last look at the dark horizon. Whatever this sunset had marked, whatever it had quietly ended or begun, he knew it was not something he could fully understand yet. With that thought lingering, he turned slightly toward the path that would eventually lead him back to his car, carrying with him the weight of the evening and the unanswered questions it had stirred, knowing that this night by Lake Michigan was far from finished in its meaning. Mark took a few slow steps along the path instead of heading straight for the parking lot, his boots scraping softly against the concrete, each sound oddly amplified in the thinning crowd. The harbor lights flickered on one by one, tall poles casting pale circles onto the ground, and for a moment he watched insects gather around them, drawn by the sudden glow. It reminded him of how people gravitated toward certainty, toward anything that promised clarity in the dark, even when it was temporary. He stopped near the railing that overlooked the water and leaned forward, resting his forearms against the cold metal. Somewhere out on the lake, a freighter moved slowly north, its lights forming a distant line that seemed suspended between sky and water. Mark tried to imagine the people on board, working through the night, following a route that had been mapped long before this evening, long before his own life had taken its unexpected turn. There was comfort in that idea, the thought that some paths were steady, guided by markers that did not suddenly disappear. His phone buzzed softly in his hand, startling him. A text from Claire. "Just checking in. Are you okay?" Mark stared at the screen longer than necessary, his thumb hovering above the keyboard. He typed a few words, erased them, then typed again. "Still by the lake. I'm okay. I'll be home soon." He sent the message and slipped the phone back into his pocket, feeling both relief and a quiet guilt for not saying more. As he resumed walking, his thoughts drifted to the past few months, to the subtle signs he had ignored. The meetings that grew shorter, the projects reassigned without explanation, the way his suggestions were met with polite nods instead of engagement. At the time, he had told himself it was nothing, just another phase in a long career. Now, those moments replayed with sharper clarity, forming a pattern he wished he had recognized sooner. The path curved gently, leading him closer to the breakwater, where the sound of waves striking stone grew louder. Mark slowed again, drawn to the rhythm, each crash followed by a brief pause, like punctuation in a long, unfinished sentence. He thought about how often he had measured his life in milestones, promotions, anniversaries, completed projects, while ignoring the spaces in between, the pauses where meaning quietly accumulated. A sudden gust of wind cut across the water, forcing him to brace himself. He pulled his jacket tighter and laughed softly under his breath, surprised by the sound of his own voice in the open air. It had been a long time since he had been alone with his thoughts without distraction, without the pressure to be productive or decisive. The lake offered no advice, no solutions, only presence, and perhaps that was enough for now. Mark reached the end of the path and stood where the land met the wide expanse of water, the city now fully behind him. The skyline glowed faintly in the distance, familiar yet strangely removed, like a memory rather than a destination. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cold air fill his lungs, and felt a subtle shift inside himself, not resolution, but readiness, the sense that whatever came next would require attention, honesty, and courage he had not yet fully tapped into. When he opened his eyes again, the lake looked darker, deeper, its surface broken only by scattered reflections and the steady movement of unseen currents. Mark stayed there, suspended between leaving and lingering, knowing that this night was stretching itself open before him, offering more than he had expected, and that the story unfolding by the shore of Lake Michigan was still far from revealing everything it had begun to awaken within him. For a while, Mark did not move at all. He let the cold creep through the soles of his boots and up his legs, grounding him in the present, reminding him that this moment was real and unrepeatable. The lake breathed in front of him, slow and heavy, and the sky above had settled into a deep, starless black, the kind that swallowed thoughts and returned them altered. He felt as if he were standing at the edge of something vast, not just the water, but the unknown stretch of time ahead of him. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded receipt, crumpled from being handled too many times that day. It was from the coffee shop near his office, time-stamped 8:34 a.m., the last normal moment before everything shifted. Mark stared at the faded ink, surprised by how such a small, meaningless object could suddenly feel like evidence of a life already slipping into the past. He folded it again carefully and tucked it back where it belonged. Footsteps approached from behind, slow and deliberate. Mark turned slightly, half expecting to see no one, but the older man from the bench had risen and was walking toward him now. Up close, Mark noticed the deep lines in the man's face, the way his eyes reflected the harbor lights with a quiet sharpness that suggested long familiarity with this place. "Cold night," the man said, his voice low but steady, carrying the faint accent of someone who had spent decades in the Midwest. "It is," Mark replied, nodding. "Feels colder than it should." The man smiled faintly. "Lake does that. Makes you feel things a little stronger." He rested his hands on the railing and looked out at the water. "I come here when I need to remember where I am." Mark considered that for a moment. "Does it help?" "Sometimes," the man said. "Sometimes it just reminds me how big everything else is." They stood in silence, the kind that did not demand filling. Mark felt an unexpected sense of ease in the shared quiet, as if speaking too much would only diminish the moment. After a minute, the man continued. "First time I watched the sun set here was in the early 70s, he said. "I was about your age. Thought I had everything figured out. Turns out, I was just getting started." Mark glanced at him, curiosity stirring. "What brought you here back then?" The man chuckled softly. "Lost my job. Same day my wife told me she was pregnant. World had a funny sense of timing." He paused, then added, "Didn't feel funny at the time." Mark felt a tightening in his chest, a sense of recognition. "What did you do?" "I stood right about where you're standing now," the man said, gesturing toward the water. "Watched the sun go down. Then I went home and told myself I'd figure it out the next day." He shrugged. "And somehow, I did. Not the way I planned, but the way I needed." The wind gusted again, and the man adjusted his coat. "Name's Walter," he said, extending a hand. "Mark," he replied, shaking it. Walter's grip was firm, warm despite the cold. "Well, Mark," Walter said, releasing his hand, "whatever brought you out here tonight, don't rush to make sense of it. Some things need the dark before they're clear in the morning." With that, Walter nodded once more and began walking back toward the benches, his figure gradually blending into the dim light. Mark watched him go, feeling as though the brief encounter had anchored him to something solid, something human, in the vastness of the evening. Alone again, Mark turned back to the lake. The water seemed unchanged, indifferent to the exchange that had just taken place, yet Mark felt subtly altered by it. The last warmth of the day was gone now, replaced by the sharp clarity of night. He took a deep breath, his mind quieter than it had been hours earlier, and stayed where he was, listening to the lake, knowing that this night still had more to reveal before he would finally turn away from the shore. Mark remained at the railing long after Walter disappeared from view, replaying the brief conversation in his mind, not word for word, but feeling by feeling. There was something about the way the older man spoke, calm without being dismissive, honest without sounding rehearsed, that lingered. It made Mark think about time differently, not as something racing away from him, but as something layered, moments stacked quietly on top of one another, each influencing the next in ways that were not always visible. He finally pushed himself away from the railing and began walking again, this time following the curve of the harbor path that led farther from the parking lot and closer to the water treatment pier. The lights were sparser here, leaving stretches of shadow where the lake blended seamlessly into the night sky. He slowed his pace, listening to his footsteps, feeling the subtle vibration of wind coming off the water. The city felt distant now, like a separate world operating on schedules and obligations that no longer applied to him in quite the same way. Mark thought about the next morning. He would wake up without an alarm for the first time in years, no inbox waiting to be cleared before breakfast, no meeting agenda to review while brushing his teeth. The thought was both unsettling and strangely liberating. He wondered how silence would feel in his kitchen at 7 a.m., how coffee would taste when it was not rushed, how the day might stretch open without instructions attached to it. As he walked, memories surfaced in no particular order. His first job site out of college, standing in steel-toed boots that were still too stiff, feeling proud and terrified at the same time. The night he proposed to Claire, nervous enough that his hands shook while holding the ring. The birth of their daughter, Lucy, now 13, who had recently started answering questions with one-word replies and closing her bedroom door more often than not. Each memory arrived uninvited, but none felt intrusive. They were simply there, like reflections on the water, appearing when the angle was right. The wind carried a faint sound of music from somewhere behind him, maybe a car radio passing along the drive, the melody stretched thin by distance. It made him think of the playlists he used to listen to while driving to work, the same songs repeated until they lost their meaning. He wondered what he would listen to now, what kind of sound fit a life that was no longer neatly labeled. Mark reached a point where the path narrowed, bordered by low fencing and patches of tall grass that rustled softly. He stopped again, drawn by the smell of the lake here, stronger, less filtered by concrete and traffic. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the scent settle, and felt another small shift inside himself, the sense that he was beginning to pay attention again, really pay attention, in a way he had not for a long time. His phone buzzed once more. This time it was a voicemail notification, his mother. He did not listen to it yet. He knew her voice would carry concern, questions she tried not to sound anxious asking. He loved her for that restraint, but tonight, he wanted to remain exactly where he was, suspended between responsibilities, allowed to exist without responding. He sat down on a low stone wall and stretched his legs out in front of him, staring at the dark water. The lake seemed endless, its surface hiding currents and depths he could not see. He thought about how often he had designed structures meant to resist forces like these, calculating load and stress, accounting for worst-case scenarios. And yet, no amount of training had prepared him for the instability of his own life shifting beneath his feet. A cloud passed overhead, briefly obscuring the moon, and the darkness deepened. Mark felt his shoulders relax, as if the night itself was giving him permission to stop trying to hold everything together. He thought about Walter again, about standing in the same place decades earlier, facing his own uncertainty. The idea that someone else had stood here, felt this same weight, and moved forward anyway, made the future feel less abstract, less threatening. Mark imagined telling Lucy about his job, how her brow would furrow in concern, how she would ask if they were still going to take the trip they had talked about for winter break. He imagined reassuring her, even if he was not entirely sure what reassurance meant yet. He imagined Claire listening quietly, asking careful questions, already thinking 3 steps ahead. He felt grateful for them, for the life they had built, imperfect as it was. Time passed unnoticed. The cold intensified, but Mark welcomed it, the physical sensation keeping him anchored. Somewhere out on the lake, another horn sounded, deeper this time, echoing across the water. He pictured the freighter again, steady and slow, guided by lights and maps, moving forward regardless of weather or doubt. He wondered if people were more like that than they realized, capable of continuing even when the route ahead was obscured. Mark stood again, joints stiff from the cold, and began walking back the way he had come. The harbor lights now felt warmer, more familiar. He noticed small details he had missed earlier, a discarded glove near a bench, a coffee cup tucked beside a trash can, evidence of other lives intersecting briefly with this place. It comforted him to know that he was not alone in his quiet reckoning, even if he never knew the stories of those who passed through. As he approached the area where he had first watched the sunset, he paused one last time. The horizon was completely dark now, the colors of the evening replaced by a uniform night. Yet Mark felt no disappointment. The beauty of the sunset lingered in him, not as an image, but as a sensation, a reminder that endings did not always announce themselves loudly, and that beginnings often arrived disguised as loss. He did not know yet what this night would come to represent in the story of his life. He only knew that something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. The lake had witnessed it, indifferent yet present, as it had for countless others before him. Mark took a slow breath, feeling the cold air fill his lungs, and stood there a while longer, letting the moment stretch, aware that he was still standing inside the unfolding of something not yet finished, something that would continue long after he finally turned and made his way home. Mark stayed rooted to the spot even after the decision to leave had already formed in his mind. It felt important not to rush the ending of this moment, as if standing there a few minutes longer might allow him to carry something invisible with him, something steady, back into the rest of his life. The lake no longer reflected the sky. It reflected only the scattered lights from shore, broken and wavering, and he thought about how clarity often arrived the same way, not all at once, but in fragments that had to be pieced together over time. He finally turned away from the water and walked toward the parking area, his breath visible now with each exhale. The sound of gravel under his boots marked his return to motion, to direction. His car sat where he had left it hours earlier, a thin layer of moisture forming on the windshield. Before getting in, Mark rested his hand on the roof for a moment, feeling the cold metal, grounding himself in something solid and familiar. Inside the car, the heater took time to respond, blowing out air that was more noise than warmth at first. Mark did not start the engine right away. Instead, he sat with his hands on the steering wheel, looking out through the windshield toward the dark outline of the lake, now barely visible beyond the rows of parked cars. He thought about how easy it would be to turn the key, drive home, and let this night slowly fade into a memory softened by routine. The thought unsettled him. He reached into the center console and pulled out a small notebook he kept for work, its pages filled with diagrams and half-written notes. Flipping to the back, he found a blank page. On impulse, he picked up a pen and wrote a single sentence, slow and deliberate, as if the act itself mattered. Pay attention to what this moment is asking of you. He closed the notebook without rereading the words, trusting that they would mean something later. The engine started with a low rumble, and Mark eased the car out of the parking space, headlights cutting through the darkness. As he drove away from the harbor, the city gradually reclaimed him. Streetlights, traffic signals, storefronts still open despite the hour. Life continued, steady and indifferent, yet Mark felt different moving through it now, as if the pace had shifted just enough for him to notice. At a red light near Wilson Avenue, Mark checked his phone again. Another message from Claire had come through. "Take your time. We'll talk when you're ready." He felt a quiet gratitude for her patience, for the way she understood him without pressing. He typed back, "On my way. Love you." The words felt heavier than usual, more intentional. The drive north along Lake Shore Drive was nearly empty, the road stretching ahead in long, dark curves. To his right, the lake was a vast presence, unseen but felt, a constant companion beyond the barrier. Mark kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts drifted freely now, less tangled than before. He considered calling an old colleague, someone who had once mentioned starting his own firm. He considered taking time off, really taking time, something he had never allowed himself to do. The ideas did not feel urgent. They felt possible. As he crossed into Evanston, familiar landmarks appeared, the grocery store on the corner, the quiet residential streets lined with trees now stripped bare for winter. Mark turned onto his street and slowed, noticing the warm glow from the windows of the houses, each one holding its own private evening. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light flicked on automatically, just as he had imagined earlier, a small, unremarkable detail that now carried weight. Before getting out of the car, Mark sat for a final moment, listening to the ticking sound of the engine as it cooled. He thought about the sunset again, about the way it had marked something without demanding acknowledgement. He knew that tomorrow would bring questions, conversations, decisions that could not be avoided. But tonight, he allowed himself a brief sense of calm, a quiet understanding that whatever had ended by the shore of Lake Michigan had also made space for something else to begin, even if its shape was still unclear. With that thought, Mark opened the car door and stepped into the cold night air, carrying the stillness of the lake with him as he walked toward the front door, knowing that the meaning of that last sunset would continue to unfold in ways he could not yet predict. Before he reached the front door, Mark stopped and looked back once more, not toward the lake itself, but toward the darkness where it existed beyond the city, vast and unseen. He understood then that the sunset he had watched was never really about the end of a day, or even the loss of a job, but about being forced to notice his own life while it was still in motion. The lake had not offered answers, only perspective, and somehow that was enough. Inside, the house was quiet, filled with the familiar sounds of evening settling in, the low hum of appliances, the distant rhythm of another family's television through the wall. Mark hung up his jacket and stood still for a moment, letting the warmth surround him. He felt changed in a way that did not need to be explained, only lived. Tomorrow would ask for action, for courage, for honesty. But tonight, he carried the memory of that fading light over Lake Michigan like a quiet promise to himself, that he would no longer move through his days without paying attention, that he would meet whatever came next with open eyes. And somewhere beyond the streets and buildings, beyond the reach of city lights, the lake remained, dark and patient, holding the reflection of countless sunsets, including the last one Mark watched before everything in his life began to shift.